Good afternoon, Earth. This is Adam Sturch broadcasting from the Mushroom Mansion, Taos, New Mexico, working on oil painting Blue Valley. Alright, today's project on this, I'm going to try to drop in a long-tailed winged green dragon blowing fire on this little castle. I'm going to retain the cartoonish, heavy outline simplicity of it, but I also intend on taking the detail quite a bit further with bricks in the castle and scales on the dragon and shadows on everything. But to get it started, I'm just going to block in the shapes.
I'm Amy Goodman with Normeet.
As we continue to look at Donald Trump's return to the White House, we turn now to look at what it means for the world, from Israel's war on Gaza to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. During his victory speech, Trump vowed that he was going to, quote, stop wars. But what will Trump's foreign policy actually look like?
We're joined now by Fatima Bhutto, award-winning author of several works of fiction and nonfiction, including The Runaways, New Kings of the World. She is co-editing a book along with Sonia Valero titled Gaza, The Story of a Genocide, due out next year. She writes a monthly column for Zeteo. Let's start off by just responding to Trump's runaway victory across the United States, Fatima.
Well, Amy, I don't think it's an aberration that he won. I think it's an aberration that he lost in 2020. And I think anyone looking at the American elections for the last year, even longer, could see very clearly that the Democrats were speaking to, I'm not sure who, to a hall of mirrors. They ran an incredibly weak and actually macabre campaign. To see Kamala Harris describe her politics as one of joy as she promised the most lethal military in the world, talking about women's rights in America, essentially focusing those rights on the right to termination, while the rest of the world has watched women slaughtered in Gaza for 13 months straight. It's very curious to think that they thought a winning strategy was Beyonce, and that Taylor Swift was somehow a political winning strategy that was going to defeat Trump, who was speaking to people, who was speaking against wars. Whether we believe him or not, it was a marked difference from what Kamala Harris was saying and was not saying.
And Fatima, you wrote a piece for Zeteo earlier this year titled Gaza has exposed the shameful hypocrisy of Western feminism. So you just mentioned the irony of Kamala Harris as the second presidential candidate who's a woman, where so much of the campaign was about women, and the fact that of what's been unfolding on women, against women and children in Gaza for the last year. If you could elaborate.
We've seen, over the last year, 70% of those slaughtered in Gaza by Israel, and let's also be clear, by America, because it's American bombs and American diplomatic cover that allows this slaughter to continue unabated. 70% of those victims are women and children. We have watched children with their heads blown off. We have watched children with no surviving family members find themselves in hospital with limbs missing. Gaza has the largest cohort of child amputees in the world. And we have seen newborns left to die as Israel switches off electricity and fuel of hospitals. So for Kamala Harris to come out and talk repeatedly about abortion, and I say this as someone who is pro-choice, who has always been pro-choice, was not just macabre, but it's obscene. It's an absolute betrayal of feminism, because feminism is about liberation. It's not about termination, and it's about protecting women at their most vulnerable and at their most frightened. And there was no sign of that. We also saw Kamala Harris bring out celebrities. The utter vacuousness of bringing out Jennifer Lopez, Beyonce, and others to talk about being a mother, while mothers are being widowed, are being orphaned in Gaza. It was not just tone deaf. It seemed to have a certain hostility, a certain contempt for the suffering that the rest of us have been watching. I'd also like to add to Robin's point about toxic masculinity, there was so much toxicity in Kamala Harris's campaign. I watched her laugh with Oprah as she spoke about shooting someone who might enter her house with a gun and giggling and saying her PR team may not like that, but she would kill them. You don't need to be a man to practice toxic masculinity, and you don't need need to be white to practice white supremacy, as we've seen very clearly from this election cycle.
And yet, Fatima Bhutto, if you look at what Trump represented, and certainly the Muslim American community, the Arab American community, Jewish progressives, young people, African Americans, certainly understood what Trump's policy was when he was president. And it's rare, president comes back to serve again after a term away. It's only happened once before in history. But you have, for example, Trump moving the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem. You have an illegal settlement named after Trump in the West Bank. The whole question of Netanyahu and his right-wing allies in Israel pushing for annexation of the West Bank, where Trump would stand on this. And of course, you have the Abraham Accords, which many Palestinians felt left them out completely. If you can talk about this, these were put forward by Trump and his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, who, when the massive Gaza destruction was at its height, talked about Gaza as waterfront real estate.
Absolutely. There's no question that Trump has been a malign force, not just when it concerns Palestinians, but frankly out in the world. But I would argue there's not very much difference between what these two administrations or parties do. The difference is that Trump doesn't have the gloss and the charisma of an Obama, or, I mean, I can't even say that Biden has charisma, but certainly the gloss. Trump says it, they do it. The difference, I can't really tell the difference anymore. We saw the Biden administration send over 500 shipments of arms to Israel, betraying America's own laws, the fact that they are not allowed to export weapons of war to a country committing gross violations of human rights. We saw Bill Clinton trotted out in Michigan to tell Muslims that actually they should stop killing Israelis and that Jews were there before them. I mean, it was an utterly contemptuous speech. So what is the difference exactly? We saw Bernie Sanders, who was mentioned earlier, write an op-ed in The Guardian in the days before the election, warning people that if they were not to vote for Kamala Harris, if Donald Trump was to get in, think about the climate crisis. Well, we've watched Israel's emissions in the first 5 months of their deadly attack on Gaza released more planet-warming gases into the atmosphere than 20 of the world's most climate-vulnerable nations released in a year. So I don't quite see that there is a difference between what Democrats allow and what Trump brags about. I think it's just a question of crudeness and decorum and politeness. One has it and one doesn't. In a sense, Trump is much clearer for the rest of the world because he says what he's going to do, and you take him at his word, whereas we have been gaslit and lied to by Anthony Blinken on a daily basis now since October 7th. Every time that AOC or Kamala Harris spoke about fighting desperately for a ceasefire, we saw more carnage, more massacres, and Israel committing crimes with total impunity. It wasn't under Trump that Israel has killed more journalists than have ever been killed in any recorded conflict. It's under Biden that Israel has killed more UN workers than have ever been killed in the UN's history. So I'm not sure there's a difference, and we'll have to wait to see in the months ahead. But I don't think anyone is bracing for an upturn. Certainly people didn't vote for Kamala Harris. I'm not sure they voted for Trump. We know that she lost 14 million votes from Biden's win in 2020. And we know that those votes just didn't come out for the Democrats. Some may have migrated to Trump, some may have gone to third parties, but 14 million just didn't go anywhere.
So Fatma, if you could, tell us what do you think the reasons are for that? I mean, the kind of, as you said, because it is really horrifying what has unfolded in Gaza in the last 13 months. You've written about this. You now have an edited anthology that you're editing, co-editing. What do you think accounts for this? The sheer disregard for the lives of tens of thousands of Palestinians who've been killed in Gaza?
It's a total racism on the part not just of America, but I'm speaking of the West here. This has been betrayed over the last year. The fact that Ukraine is spoken about with an admiration, Zelensky is spoken about with a sort of hero worship. Ukrainian resistors to Russia's invasion are valorized. Nancy Pelosi wore a bracelet of bullets used by the Ukrainian resistance against Trump. But Palestinians are painted as terrorists, are dehumanized to such an extent. We saw that dehumanization from the mouths of Bill Clinton, no less, from the mouths of Kamala Harris, who interrupted somebody speaking out against the genocide and saying, I'm speaking. What is more toxically masculine than that? We've also seen a concerted crackdown in universities across the United States on college students. I'm speaking also here of my own alma mater of Columbia University of Barnard College that called the NYPD, who fired live ammunition at their students. This didn't happen. This extreme response didn't happen in protests against apartheid. It didn't happen in protests against Vietnam in quite the same way. And all I can think is America and the West, who have been fighting Muslim countries for the last 25, 30 years, see it as acceptable to do so. Our deaths are acceptable to them, and genocide is not a red line. And to go back to what Robin mentioned earlier about the working class that is absolutely ignored in America, and I would make the argument across the West too, they have watched administration after president and congressmen give billions and billions of dollars to Ukraine while they have no relief at home. They have no relief from debt, they have no relief from student debt. They have no medical care, no coverage. They're struggling to survive. And this is across the board. And after Ukraine, they saw billions go to Israel in the same way, while they get, frankly, nothing.
Dr. Mabuto, we want to thank you so much for being with us, award-winning author of a number of works of fiction and nonfiction, including The Runaways and New Kings of the World, co-editing a book called Gaza, The Story of a Genocide, due out next year. Writes a monthly column for Zateo. Coming up, we look at Trump's vow to deport as many as 20 million immigrants. And J.D. Vance saying, yes, U.S. children born of immigrant parents could also be deported. Stay with us. Caravana by Las Cafeteras. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org. War, Peace, and the Presidency. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermin Sheikh.
We end today's show looking at Donald Trump's threat to deport as many as 20 million immigrants living in the United States. It's a threat he repeated on an almost daily basis on the campaign trail, including at the Republican National Convention.
That's why, to keep our families safe, the Republican platform promises to launch the largest deportation operation in the history of our country. Even larger than that of President Dwight D. Eisenhower from many years ago. He was a moderate, but he believed very strongly in borders. He had the largest deportation operation we've ever had.
We're joined right now by a historian who's closely studied past mass deportation programs in the United States. Ana Raquel Mignon is an associate professor of history at Stanford University and the author of In the Shadow of Liberty, The Invisible History of Immigrant Detention in the United States. The recent piece for Dissent magazine is titled Trump's Deportation Model. So, Professor Mignon, if you can start off by talking about Trump's victory, what that model is, and his famous motto, Make America Great Again. Go back in history and talk about the mass deportations of people in the United States.
Thank you. In many ways, we think that Trump is a new model, a person who completely goes against the grain of American history in terms of deportations, in terms of his treatment of immigrants. But as he noted himself, that is absolutely not true. What he was referring to when he spoke about Eisenhower was an operation that occurred in 1954 titled Operation Wetback. And this was a massive deportation campaign. The tactics were military tactics. They brought tanks, they brought border patrol people all throughout the border, airplanes. People were grabbed from their houses and taken to the border, stopped outside of their jobs and taken to the border. Their families didn't know where they had been. It was a very cruel operation. In the year 1954, the year of Operation Wetback, over 1 million people were deported. And this is the model that Trump says that he is going to expand. And it comes at huge costs to America, to its communities, and to the people themselves. In the United States, when Operation Wetback happened, communities were destroyed. People were left without central members, without churchgoers, without breadwinners. Families who relied on some of the folks who were deported had to either rely on welfare or find jobs immediately. Children were left without parents. Many employers needed workers who were deported. It was bad for the U.S. economy. It was also bad for American civil rights. Many Mexican Americans, people who were born in the United States, could be walking through the streets and considered to be Mexican just because they quote-unquote looked Mexican, and their civil rights were not protected. Their constitutional rights were not protected. The deportation of American citizens is something that we have seen over and over again. For example, in the 1930s, there was also a massive deportation campaign against Mexicans. It occurred, of course, during the Great Depression. We estimate that from 350,000